Yeah, you're welcome to the second part of our exploration of formalism, and we are looking at new criticism. New criticism is the second very viable and unique school of formalism that developed precisely in the West. We can say that it's an Anglo-American theory, which came up in the 1940s, started in the 1940s, although just true to any theory, there would have been germs that have been informing things related to it and eventually find it coming up at this very important time. Now, when we talk about new criticism, we are talking about a form of theorizing, just like the Russian formalists, that emphasized its gaze on the form of literature as superior to the content or the context that literature brings about. And so when we talk about new criticism, of course, the term new should tell us that there must be an old form of conceptualized criticism that the theorists were definitely trying to distance themselves from. And then new criticism was a kind of interrogation of an immediate older form of circulated criticism, which to a very great extent looked at literature from a kind of language-based concept. By extension, tried to observe the history of a word or the history of a particular language or an association of a particular use of language with a past historical form or culture or relationship, and try to look at literary language from a purely linguistic perspective, relying on past historical data of how you look at an author and how that author, the author's life, the author's emotions, the author's context was signified in appreciating literature. And this also extends to a whole affront against the practice of what was called literary appreciation. For the new critics of the Anglo-American divide, they were actually going against the practice of picking up literature and looking at its narrative from the context of the emotional appeal, the ideas of beauty, literary beauty that fused with author experience or looked at a particular society within an historical context, and by extension, applying the meaning of characterization and setting and plot and all that to certain historical and emotional category. For the new critics, just like the Russian formalists, literature was nothing except an aesthetic elevation from any form of verbal practice that communicated to people. So for them, the essence of literature was the fact that it had its meaning in the rhetorical force of language, of the plots, of how the elements of language brought about the significance and the distance from any other communicative form within society. In other words, language and literature were fused together in as much as language showed the difference of literary language from the way language was used within normal or certain elements of professions that use language in registers, so to speak. Now, in talking about new criticism like the Russian formalists, it was much to the intent of new critics to look at literature as not contingent, that is, reliant on the feelings of the author or what the author meant or how the reader interpreted literature from an emotional point of view or from a particular personal history perspective, as different from how another reader will come across literature. For the new critics, just quite close to the Russian formalists, what was very essential was the form of literature, the aesthetics of the literature, the rhetorical force of the literature, and how we may be able to find a kind of elevation of style in literature quite different from other forms of verbal expressions or verbal arts. Having said that, I want to look a little bit closely into this phenomenon of new criticism. I told us that it was taking its difference from older forms that were reliant on the author, reliant on author experience, or looking at the meaning of certain phenomena in that literature, okay? as evoking a particular historical experience or looking at certain practices in certain societies. No, they weren't interested in that. They were rather looking at the text, just like the Russian formalists again. They were looking at the text as self-contained, as imaginatively self-contained, as having its own element of difference from other forms of communicative apparatuses. And they were also looking at the text as a form that was only literary because of its aesthetics, not because of the content or some ideologies injected in it, or some politics evoked within it, or some kind of class ratifications or exclusions that literature was going to make. No, they were rather looking at literature as something that, just like the Russian formalists, as I said, self-contained in aesthetic form. Now, the main authors of New Criticism were understandably American, North Americans of the United States of America, and of course, this filtered into some other Western climes, the UK, and of course, Canada and the like. And with time, it informed a kind of authorization of literary criticism in the domain of world literature that we can say that up till today, elements of new criticism still survive, either consciously or unconsciously, within the arena of literary production. For example, if we begin to talk about the idea of close reading, or we talk about even what we call literary appreciation, or looking at elements of form, or looking at characterization, setting, and things of that nature, a number of these elements that we might see as very, very basic are thanks to what the new critics were able to circulate. Definitely also conjoining with the examples of the Russian formalists that had been in vogue much earlier. And now, the main critics of new criticism were people like John Crowell Ransom. In fact, John Crowell Ransom was the person that we can say was responsible for the naming of this theory as such, because in 1941, he published a thesis which he named the New Criticism. And it was right from then, and because of the elements, the issues he was trying to bring about, you find out that New Criticism gained its popularity and definitely got named after that very, very canonical text. Some other very important critics of New Criticism that we can recall include people like Clent Brooks, people like Alan Tate, people like W.K. Wimsatt, and people like Monroe Beardsley. We can talk about people like I.A. Richards, obviously. We can talk about people like T.S. Eliot, a number of them doing a whole lot of things with their own reading of aesthetics as a literary form and as a literary thing that must necessarily be projected when we talk about literature. Now, when we talk about new criticism, there are certain particular ideas they were actually projecting. Some ideas that were very, very important that the new critics were bringing in. Number one, they talked about the superiority of form over content, and the issue of form was reliant on matters arising in language, especially associated with literature, that distinguish literature as an aesthetic form from any other verbal form of experimentation or production. So literature, for the new critics as well, definitely had a kind of standardized imagination. It had a kind of canonical boundary by which you could signify something as being literary and something as not literary. In other words, when we talk about this kind of thing, even as some of the critics themselves had noted, there were ways in which certain artists to be preferred over others. For instance, I know that when you talk about people like William Shakespeare, because of the visibility of that writer during the Renaissance period, and of course because of other contingent politics that new criticism was involved in, but which it wasn't actually acknowledging as a kind of pragmatic posturing of literature, comparing somebody like William Shakespeare with a writer who happened to be a woman and who rarely ever got known during Shakespeare's time will be going a little bit too far in talking about what was literary and what was not considered as very literary. So if we looked at William Shakespeare, you found out that a person like Afra Ben, who happened to be a woman and who also wrote very robust literature during Shakespeare, could not be compared because somehow Shakespeare had caught his niche with a number of very, very remarkable and memorable literatures that delved into not only sanguine in the ways that language was used and a lot of ingenious forms of philosophizing, and also presenting the genres of drama and poetry as things that could be circulated around the globe as aesthetic definitions in themselves. Afra Ben, perhaps because of the fact that she was a woman and the age of Shakespeare did not actually allow the woman as a part creator of literature that could be consumed in the public, or did not even encourage the publication of what was written by women because conceptually women were bracketed off the realm of imaginative heights, possibilities of being very, very ever canonical in writing. And of course, this kind of thing towards our time had to find a situation in which women that were very, very keen on writing had to mask their identities with male names. So in a way, if you brought out a writer like Afra Ben and you compared sources with William Shakespeare, depending on a number of dynamics that went through politics of acknowledgement, and of course, definitely the ways in which experimentations with language were made, you find out that Shakespeare might be very much acknowledged beyond people like Afra Ben in a formalist reading of literature. We also know that if you were to compare, let's say, for example, oral literatures, let's say in Africa, for example, as forms of creative experimentations, and you are to compare them, even though they in their rights very aesthetic, or you are looking at write-ups that come from India, you are looking at some of their very important oral literary traditions, and compared this with, let's say, somebody like Homer's Iliad, it's very, very likely that the gaze of new criticism will find nothing literary. In fact, they might have said, perhaps, for example, looking at Yoruba Oriki, or looking at some poetic renditions in Swahili, or looking at certain forms of haiku, might have been very, very strange to them. Haiku from Japan, strange to them when orbiting the space of what you could call proper literature, in quotes, or proper poetry in the context of new critical gaze. Because definitely, to a very great extent, these formal forms of write-ups were either known or unknown, were already necessarily Western, already necessarily English, and already necessarily conforming to certain elitist, as we might call it today, certain elitist forms of literary productions that might not be very, very alignable with our own very diffusive, popular cultural breakages that we might call literature today. To exemplify that, we might just look, for example, at some of the statements that some of these literary critics made. For example, if we look at T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent, that was published in 1919, you will find out that we have a kind of situation where the germs of what the new critics would call literature were getting theorized. In Tradition and the Individual Talent, Eliot was talking about what he called tradition as not necessarily a kind of something we might say that we have discontinued from, and it stays in the past, and it relies in a kind of memorialization of what was happening within a particular historical frame, not quite ours. That tradition will not necessarily mean something that is in the past or something that is regurgitated just as a form of remembering what literature should be, but that rather tradition is part of the inescapable newness of artistry that literature produced, even in its own present generation. In other words, if you are talking about the individual talent, which refers to the literary author, you are talking about somebody that had consciously or unconsciously got aligned with what we may call a system of formats, a system of literary formatting that defined literariness within the imagination of the Anglo-American conception of literature. In other words, by tradition, the new text or the author that is doing something seemingly new is definitely doing nothing new. It's rather dissolved, so to speak, within a particular continuum of the greatness of literary production, which we even go back as far as Homer, to the times of William Wordsworth, to the time of William Shakespeare, to the time of Yeats and Keats, and so on and so forth, to the present moment where you could say that you are cutting your particular narrative in literature. In other words, somehow we may even say that the beginnings or some of the early foundations of what you might call intertextuality today in post-structuralism had started from the phenomenon of what T.S. Eliot was saying in tradition and the individual talent. He was by extension saying that if you talk about great literature, that the author has no new thing he's actually doing. That doesn't erase the originality of the present author, but that author is inescapably intertwined within the narratives or the examples or the designed platforms and motifs of earlier great literary examples that he either consciously or unconsciously continues. By extension, literature is always already known the moment it is produced because of a classified form of aestheticism that is definitely away from a street kind of consumption or popular kind of cultural type of literariness, or a kind of production that does not, if you remember what Victor Shklovsky was saying, okay, in his case of Russian formalism, that was not defamiliarizing. People like I.A. Richards, with his practical criticism, definitely told this kind of genetic elements of what was seen as literariness as cut away from what they saw as the excesses of the author being there, forming what must be consumed as a rhetorical and very acknowledgeable piece of art. No, the new critic was rather of the opinion of an already made high cultural form of literature in its literariness that had always been there from the great literary times of canonized writers, Western writers, and authors like Homer, Wordsworth, T.S. Eliot himself, because he happened to be a formidable writer, and of course, W.B. Yeats. Okay, that's very memorable writer of Second Coming. Now, we are coming to a context where literature begins to be classified theoretically in its elements in new criticism. And we must go a little bit further and come to certain rhetorical labelings that we find within this context. For example, in new criticism, there is that particular focus, especially when reading a work of art, on what is called close reading. Close reading is a device that systematically designs aesthetic properties that makes characterization, dialogue, setting, the storyline very acknowledgeable, very punchy, very interesting to call it as worthy of literature. So if you're talking about a close reading of particular elements within a kind of prose fiction, for example, you might be looking at characterization by looking at the context in which a particular character evolves and distinguishes himself or herself within literature. You're probably going to look at how language properly situates certain scenes in literature and how these become elements that we can easily identify when we do a very important story of it. If you are doing a criticism of poetry also, you might be looking at elements that make it poetic, like the rhyme schemes, the issue of relationship of a particular sign to the other, and how this produces the particular feeling you have as you are reading the literature. In other words, close reading is a kind of technology, if you like, that designs the literariness of literature within a form of linguistic presentation of communication, of course, which literature is involved in. Now, certain things the formalists began to circulate actually came from some other forms of critics. But of course, of great renown are two of such classifications. And these come from the scholars, two scholars called W.K. Wimsatt. Actually, that W is William K. Wimsatt and Monroe Beardsley. They published a position on reading the aesthetics of literature. In fact, they all about literariness in two kind of significations, which they demarcated as what they call fallacies. And these fallacies involve, number one, intentional fallacy, and number two, affective fallacy. By intentional fallacy, that is trying to tell us what makes the literary text very, very unique in its formation as literature. The intentional fallacy is what they see as the error of readers in trying to make meaning of literature by trying to find out the intention of the author in writing that literature. In other words, the intentional fallacy is a way of reading the meaning of literature from an assumption of what its author meant in putting in that literature. For them, intentional fallacy is actually a myth because there is no way of knowing the intention of an author by reading the literature. You need to encounter the text on its own and decipher and consume what it is giving you for pleasure, for memory, for education, as the case may be, and it will be something that you can acknowledge as something you have personally experienced, not necessarily something universally transmittable or something coming from a particular source called an author. The second fallacy they found out in people's relationship with literature was what they called affective fallacy. In other words, a situation in which a reader or the text is given meaning by the emotional relationship of a reader to it. In other words, it goes against a private interpretation of the text by the conceptualization of the reader or the emotional response, the emotional appeal it has to the reader. By extension, it also takes it away from the reader to make private meanings from literature. And this domain of reading literature to a very great extent circulated within the Western academy, and it also had its own very important effect globally in looking at literary theory. We can say that formalism, to a very great extent, actually brought about a ground where a number of responses, critical responses, philosophical responses had to come up, and thankfully, which has made literature a very, very wonderful piece of human production that has salience to several fields. In fact, right within those fields and bringing them out. Ladies and gentlemen, we are continuing with this when we look at the strengths of this perspective of theorizing and criticism and the weaknesses. You like to see that, especially where it intersects with cultural phenomena, racial discourse, gender politics, and how it goes into other fields that are cognate to literature like music, dance, graphic arts, entertainment, and things of that nature. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Don't ever forget it. I don't think you wouldn't want to. You need to subscribe to it because a number of things are coming up. You need to let other people know about it. You've got to be able to like it. You've got to be able to continue with it. And let me also tell us something. Anyway, I'll tell you that when we come back.